Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Straight Up Podcast. My name is Jared, and for those of us who are watching, you might notice it's a little less crowded on the screen today. That's because Ricky wasn't able to make it to this show. Thankfully, we have a great guest who will compensate for him not being here. Please welcome the Director of Operations for Young Americans Against Socialism, Allie Rogers. Allie, thank you for coming on.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All Alrighty. So before we get too far into the discussion, let's hear a little bit about yourself and how you got to this point.
Like you said, I work with Young Americans Against Socialism, and Morgan Zegers started the organization, and I've been there for, I would say, a little over a year now. And the position has just grown into something super fun and exciting, and it totally fits like my mojo. I'm the director of operations, so basically, I oversee all the content, I do all the research, a lot of the writing for the organization. And yeah, I'm excited to be here to talk about what we do and all of that stuff. So,
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
yeah.
So before we get too deep into the conversation about socialism, I guess we should probably try and make one distinction pretty clear. So, a lot of times when you talk about socialism, communism is brought up a lot as well.
Yeah.
What is the difference between socialism and communism? And what are maybe some of the parallels there as well that cause people to get confused between the two?
Yeah, well, they're both obviously on the leftist scale of politics. We say that socialism is an economic system, so it's the step that they have to install before they get to communism, which is the end goal. And communism is an authoritarian, tyrannical, usually dictatorship and regime that just basically controls every aspect of the people's lives that live under communism, and they aim to abolish private property. They attack freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And so, our mission as an organization is to first interview survivors and those who have fled oppression and tyranny, communism, socialism, any of the above. And then we also want to educate our viewers and supporters on the dangers of socialism and help people understand the actual tactics of the left, and so that we can teach the younger generations those red flags that we're not being taught in the classrooms.
Absolutely. And what are maybe some of those red flags that you bring up that people need to look out for?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, I mean, we look at, we've interviewed people all over the world. We've interviewed people that have left China, Venezuela, Hungary, Romania, and Cuba, and so many others. But there are reoccurring themes that we see. And first and foremost, we always hear from the survivors that the messaging of the left is very promising and it sounds really good. And so when they say, Hugo Chavez promised free healthcare, and then we can now look back and see, okay, first, that free healthcare is not something that we want to have in America because it doesn't serve the people like how they've promised. And then, we look at the promises from Lenin, starting from Lenin. He was the first to promise free land, free bread, and peace. And so that led Russia into a 5-year famine that killed millions. And so we can see these redundant promises, and then the failure of them. And then, yeah, the messaging, especially, is very similar that we see from the left today. And so, they're advocating to abolish student loans, or they're advocating again for free healthcare, universal free healthcare. And we know for a fact that that is just, those aren't good policies to instill, especially in America. And they're not policies that our Constitution supports either. And so, if we're able to reach the younger generation and really explain and show them the actual outcomes of these, empty promises, hopefully we can give them the tools to identify them, and then see, what conservatives offer, and what the Constitution promises.
Absolutely. And I thought you brought up a really good point there when you were talking about the interviews that y'all do, because
Hmm.
it really does feel like a lot of the people, especially the younger generation who is for socialism, that it sounds nice in their heads and they have
Hmm.
this way of trying to make it work, but they don't really have, those real world experiences with it like these other
Yeah.
people do. And so seeing, these promises in their head, people talking about those promises were made a long time ago by our leaders, and this is where it got us. I think that's a pretty powerful one for them.
Oh, for sure. And, Morgan has a great message behind that because the left uses emotion to reach the younger generation. And so, with our interviews and, the times that we spend hearing from people that have left these communist and socialist countries, we want to hear those real life experiences and the things that they've had to deal with and what they've had to overcome under tyranny. Like, for instance, one person that we've interviewed from Cuba, he talks about like ration cards and that they get one slice of bread a day from the local bakery, and that's not
Golly.
something that yeah, and that's not something that Bernie Sanders is out here talking about, right? Like he's advocating for the Castro policies, but he's not going to talk about the rations.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, maybe he'll
so that
get you 2 or 3 slices of bread.
Yeah.
It's a step in the right direction, but
Yeah. So we
yeah,
we really want to communicate that emotion to the younger generation as well, and the left weaponizes emotions a lot, and so we want to actually use the emotion for truth and getting the real story out and hear people and their stories of suffering under these tyrannical regimes.
absolutely. And there was kind of leaning into that, the emotional play that the left uses, because a lot of people, or I will say some people who support the idea of socialism, they seem to do it from a place of empathy. They
Yeah.
see other people less fortunate and maybe think, well, maybe they didn't have the same opportunities we did. They're down on their luck. It's not fair. But when you kind of stop and think about it, is socialism really the empathetic solution that it's being taught to be? Or is it just going to bring everybody down to that
It
level?
It absolutely does. And again, that's something that a lot of our survivors talk about is that it never brings people up. It always brings people back down. Um, and it's pretty powerful when you start to compare and contrast, the promises versus the actual, outcome of the socialist policies. And I think in general, socialism is confusing for young people to understand because it's like, well, why wouldn't we want all these people to have, free healthcare or whatever? But again, you're skipping over what the Constitution promises Americans, and the Constitution guarantees equal rights under the law. And so everyone has the same opportunities, and it's just the way that you use those opportunities to improve yourself. And that's something that America stands on, is that you can choose the path for your life. And something that one of our survivors from Venezuela, Gabby Franco, she's actually an Olympian shooter, and she talks a lot about her experience um, growing up under Chavez, and she had friends from Cuba telling her, "This man talks a lot like Castro. Like, be careful." And Gabby was always like, "Oh, whatever." She kind of pushed it off to the wayside, and that could never happen to Venezuela. And then, years down the line, it's like she started to realize. When she became an Olympic shooter, she was saying, it's harder and harder for us to find ammo. It's harder and harder for us to find, these types of guns. And she was explaining, just the slow crawl to socialism, and so it's been very eye-opening because obviously America's not in such a great place right now, and so we've had our work cut out for us because there has been just endless comparisons to the radical left today and the regimes that we have seen rise to power in the past.
Absolutely. I was wondering if maybe there was a specific country or anything like that where these stories come from that seem to parallel the situation with America a little more, maybe speak to people a little more, or if it really is just these signs are showing up in every country, a little bit here, a little bit there, and you just kind of
Yeah.
see just
Yeah,
the through line.
totally. I mean, it's a little bit here and there from all over, and something that I've realized throughout this process working with the organization and hearing these stories, it's like, we look at China, and then during the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong, they had the Red Guards. For those that don't know, the Red Guards were militant youth who were brainwashed by Mao Zedong, and they were radicals. And Mao actually allowed them. He told law enforcement to stand down and allowed these youth to go in throughout Beijing and the surrounding cities and kill, destroy, and just wreak havoc on Beijing. And it forced hundreds of thousands of people to be displaced and obviously die. And so we were drawing a lot of parallels with the Red Guards and obviously Black Lives Matter. And it was no surprise to us when it all came out that Patrice Cullors, the founder, not the CEO, the founder of Black Lives Matter, was said that she's a trained Marxist. And then there's also a clip of her praising Mao's little red book. And so that all just, it's not surprising once you start to really like look into these historical instances. And then, that's China. And then, obviously Castro had his whole thing. Like, Castro infamously said, like, I am not communist. And, you know, 2 years later, it's like he's fully instilled an entire communist regime. And so the leftists disguise themselves as well. And so you really have to look at like the wolf in the sheep's clothing.
For sure, for sure. So we've talked a little bit about the historical side of your organization, the interviews and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. There's another side of your organization. From what I was reading, there's two things that y'all really try and focus on when spreading this message, and it's the interviews and something called peer rationale. And I was wondering if maybe you
Yeah.
could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, peer rationale. So there was a study that came out, I think, in 2019 that basically said 70% of young Americans would vote for a socialist. And so the study was basically saying that young people will change their mind if it's from a peer to peer versus a teacher to a peer or a teacher to a student or within the family. It's actually peer to peer. And so we're young Americans, and we want to explain our stance on why we oppose these leftist policies and these leftist talking points. And so we're hoping to reach those people before they get fully swindled into the leftist lies. And we
Okay.
and one of our slogans is we the young people deserve to know the truth. Like, they should know what the left actually promises for
No,
its
definitely.
nation.
And these are definitely two very different approaches between the
Yeah.
interviews and the peer rationale. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if maybe do they kind of have different effects? Does one maybe work for other people a little better? Like, what's like y'all's experience between seeing these two kinds of approaches work together?
Yeah, I would say more than anything, like we hear people, they'll write us, they'll email us, or they'll comment and stuff, and they'll say, "Thank you so much for saying this," or "Thank you for so much for drawing light to this, because in my country X, Y, and Z is happening." And so we hear from people all over the world all the time. Um, and so it's like it's good to be magnifying these stories that have happened, and then people really resonate with it, because it's like, hey, wait a minute, that's happening in my country, and I'm so thankful that you're pointing out that this has happened in history, because we could see what comes next. And so, for instance, we've heard from young people from China recently, from Portugal, who want to share their stories, and who have these like these convictions, or they're seeing stuff that's happening in their culture, and they're young too, and they're like, wait a minute, this is not right. And so we're happy to help people draw those parallels for them. So
And I think a lot of people too, when they kind of get into this sort of thing where they try and talk one person out of a belief or something like that, they expect either this rejection or this instantaneous light bulb, just, oh, I was so wrong. I'm a capitalist now, or whatever it is.
yeah,
Um, but a lot of times, like, it seems like it's a slow burn for a lot of people, a lot of sitting down and thinking and things like that. So I imagine that the pure rationale, especially just kind of working through that part, that phase, is
yeah,
just really huge in getting people to realize the pitfalls of socialism.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I
So,
think that earlier you said something. Can't exactly remember what you were saying earlier about socialism, but I recently read through The Case Against Socialism by Rand Paul, and I highly recommend it. But he really hones in on that, like, socialism is the doctrine of envy, and so it's like, we were talking about how the leftists are really good at getting people to, have empathy and stuff, but also it has this underlying message of envy of, like, well, all these, greedy capitalists or the imperialists in America, have all this, but, like, and you can't, like, the capitalists say you can't, and blah blah blah, and it's like, well, that's a doctrine of envy. That's making people envy what others have, and that's not what America is for. America obviously is for choosing your own path and improving yourself and becoming an entrepreneur and creating, like, developing yourself. And why would we, like, willingly want the government to choose our path for us and willingly want the government to control so many aspects of our lives? Like, it's just, if you really sit down and have, like, explain our case, we we win. So
no, I think you're absolutely right. And I
yeah,
think a lot of people don't realize how much control they think they're forfeiting when they talk about this kind of
mm-hmm.
stuff either,
Yeah,
which is really
and
interesting just to kind of walk through somebody's train of thought through that and just kind of see
yeah,
them realizing, well, maybe, maybe
they're
not. um,
yeah, they get stuck in many different ways. Yeah,
yeah,
for
no,
sure. Yeah,
absolutely.
and it's actually really interesting, just like Lenin, or the early communists. That's something that I'm, like, really, like, honed in on lately. Just I go off on my personal stories on my Instagram and stuff.
Mhm.
But I've done a lot of research on the communists, and, like, their main, like, slogan is "Workers of the world unite," and they convince their supporters that, like, everybody will own, part of, the government or whatever, the public, private, whatever entities. But that is literally never the case. Never. Um, and so, and then again, like, even if you talk to a leftist or a communist, even that support, the CCP or the Cuban regime or whatever, around the world, they'll actually say, like, "Oh, that's not real communism," or "That's not real socialism,"
Yep.
and so that's another point that you have to kind of, like, help them think through. Some people are so far gone that it's like, it's not really worth trying to get them to think like us. But
Mhm.
we still should advocate for the truth and highlight all the promises that the Constitution guarantees the American people. So,
Yeah, that comment about just people just too far into that, just in general with anything, it's always kind of sad to see. Um,
yeah, for sure.
I was kind of curious because you said you were talking about your fascination with Lenin and stuff, and you
Mm-hmm.
know these historical figures, these figures of socialism. Was this something that you started going down because you joined this organization, or was this something that you've been interested in for a very long time and this organization kind of came in and was like, hey, you're interested in this stuff, you know a lot about this stuff, let's you know give you a platform to
Yeah.
spread this message?
Well, I, growing up, my parents were always really big on like helping us understand how blessed we are to be Americans and how lucky we are to be born in America, and that, they were very open with us about the suffering that goes on around the world. Specifically, my mom would always talk to me about like North Korea and her concern for the North Koreans and stuff. And so I grew up having a lot of those types of conversations. And then probably around like 2020, 2021, I really started to get curious about tyrannical regimes. And this was before I started working with Morgan. And so I would just spend hours and hours a week studying, what was going on around the world under communist regimes, and the roots of communism and Karl Marx and Engels. And then it just so happened, I actually went to Turning Point's Student Action Summit 2 summers ago. So it was the summer of 2021. And I just happened to meet Morgan, and I introduced myself and all of that. And so then I saw that she was hiring for a position. And so I applied, and it just really helped that we already had, networked together, and she knew me, and we have a common friend. And so that's kind of how I got started working with Morgan. And I just feel like those months prior when I was studying and researching really prepared me to step into this role, because for those that have a decent amount of knowledge about communism, it's not always like the most like happy, uplifting research, and it could be
No.
very daunting, and it's very, you come across things that just put a pit in my stomach. And so
Uh,
um, those months of research prior just kind of like helped prepare me for what I was stepping into, and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, but I mean, one thing that really like sparked my curiosity is that so I used to live in LA. I lived there for 9 years, and UCLA is down there, obviously. And I
mhm.
caught wind that during the campus's, fair for all the clubs on campus, there was a communist club that was openly, out
Really?
in the public. Yes,
Not even a
yes, it's called
socialist club, just a full on communism club.
full communism, and it's called the Revcom. So if anyone
That's
wants to look it up,
insane.
yes, and they fully advocate for like the new type of communism, and
Oh my
it
goodness.
fascinated me because I had never. I was just like living in my little like bubble, and then I came across this club, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is being like accepted to like be fully operating on a UCLA public school campus. Like it just really blew
Yeah.
my mind, and it opened my eyes to just how much they've been able to get their foot in the door. And so it like it triggered all of this, desire to really like start researching their tactics and realizing like, wow, they are getting their message out, and like it's not the truth, and it's very
Mhm.
dangerous to young people to be hearing this. So
Oh yeah,
yeah, and
no, it
part
really
of
is amazing when you see just how
yeah.
far it's seeped into, not just our
Hmm.
government, but just our citizens, our especially Gen
Yeah.
Z in general. How
Yeah.
deep that's taken root in a lot of that. I didn't know it gone that far, but
Oh yeah.
um, you
Hmm.
see the signs pretty much everywhere you go, and a lot of the
Yeah.
people who advocate for socialism, especially Gen Z, they talk about it like this overhaul, like this big uprising, and just we're just gonna hit it and we're gonna change to socialism and this is gonna be great. Well, it's not an overnight thing. Like
Yeah.
this
No.
is something that it takes time. It takes the wrong leaders with the wrong citizens and the right people not stepping up to speak up about it. So
Right.
that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I think y'all's organization is really good, because you don't get a lot of people attacking that, especially from that younger demographic, from the future of our leaders and our citizens, and just the voices that'll speak out against these things.
Yeah, for sure. And while we target Gen Z, lately we've been really wanting to target even younger children, because we obviously see the radical left moving into elementary schools and even school preschool and kindergarten, and that's something that we see that happens in communist countries, that the indoctrination begins in preschool and kindergarten. And so anyway, on that note, I actually we're doing free ebook resources on our website. They're available to download. And I just wrote and published one of the ebooks. It's called How to Talk to Your Kids About the Government. And it just is a very basic outline and helps parents find the words and explain the process of how it's supposed to look. And we really just wanted to lay that groundwork for people to use to help their kids understand the importance of the freedom of speech, the importance of knowing who the founding fathers were and our founding principles, and then also how to identify a tyrant and what those tyrants want to do to people. And that might be really a confusing message for students, but it needs to be talked about first in the home, and then that way they can actually reason and have the full understanding to talk to their peers about it as well. So anyway, if anyone wants to download that, they're all available on our website.
I don't think that's a bad idea. Just
Yeah.
start looking into that, reading up on that. And that kind of
Yeah.
leads into my next question, actually. Outside
Yeah.
of the audiobooks, which I think would be pretty good, what are maybe
Mhm.
some resources that you would advise people to look into and research to learn more about socialism and things of that nature?
Yeah, well, they can all obviously check out our Instagram, and that's YAAS_America on Instagram. And then you can check us out on YouTube. And our long form interviews are on our YouTube channel, The Freedom Records. That's the show that we did with all of our interviews. Um, and then we're building out our website to become more of a resource for people. And so on our website, we do have some other ebooks. We have one, How to Talk to your socialist guests. It was kind of aimed for like a Thanksgiving dinner guide, but I think it's applicable year round, obviously. And so it's good conversation starters, or, when they say this, we say that kind of comparison chart. Um, and then, there's other organizations that, we really respect and we love, and those would be, the Heritage Foundation does a lot of research, and we love the Victims of Communism. There's actually the Victims of Communism Museum. I'm super excited. I'm going this week. I don't know if people are really excited to go to that museum, but I'm just,
No,
I'm
I
looking
get it. I
forward.
had the same feelings about the Holocaust Museum when I first went to see it a while ago. It's
There
like
you go. Yeah.
I'm excited to learn about this, but I don't know. It's a weird word to use, but I understand it
Right.
fully.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to just taking it all in, I guess. So yeah, I think, in terms of research, also just keeping yourself aware and sharing it with those that you love, like sharing, these stories that we put out and the interviews, and being able to really identify the leftist tactics will just create more general awareness in our community. And that's really, what we have to focus on is within ourselves, and then, around us. So,
Mhm. No,
yeah.
and using your website to be a resource for these people sounds like
Yeah.
a great idea. Just because I'm sure it's not exactly easy looking up stuff like this on your own. Just having to go through so many different sources, but just having
Right.
that all condensed into one website, that's got to be
Yeah.
pretty good for a lot of people growing up in this generation.
Yeah.
So
For
we're
sure.
running a little short on time, so I was wondering if there was maybe
Okay.
anything you would just like to, put out for our listeners just about socialism in general, just kind of the pitfalls of it and just some of the warning signs before we, close it out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, like we said, they're look out for their messaging and their empty promises first and foremost, and check out the politicians that are saying these things. They usually, have a underlying agenda. And then secondly, like you were saying, it's a very slow process. Something to remember with socialists is that they're very patient, and so they're not going to jump before they're completely ready, and that's kind of a rules for radicals Saul Alinsky thing. But just understand that they are they believe in like aggression, slow aggression and agitation. And so being able to identify those behaviors in our society and pointing them out, and then saying that's not something our constitution supports, and understanding why it doesn't. And then the third is just really making yourself aware of these things, and again, sharing it with people, and just, I would say, just equip yourself with the knowledge of the Constitution. I think the Constitution is one of our best weapons as conservatives, and it's a protector, obviously. And the left is at certain. They have their agenda. They want to pack the courts, or they want to chip away at gun rights, or they want to censor and chip away at our freedom of speech. But we just have to understand that the Constitution is so important to protect and defend. And so the more that we, understand it, then, the harder time that they're going to have, because we're more intelligent and equipped than they are. So that's what I would say. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And this was a really
No,
great conversation.
thank you for coming on. Like I said,
Yeah.
you know a lot about this subject. You work with an organization that knows a lot about this subject, and I think it is a very important one, really for
Yeah.
any citizen, but especially the younger generation growing up. So, again, thank you so
Yes.
much for coming on. Uh,
Yeah, of
Check
course.
out the website, the organization, listeners, Young Americans
Yeah.
Against Socialism. And again, just,
Yeah.
like Allie said, equip yourselves, because this is starting to take root, and I think it's important to
Yeah.
know exactly what's going on. Allie, again, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you.